Hey there, I'm Ari from the Tech Buyers Guru, and I've got another product review for you here on the channel today. This time around, I'm checking out the new Sugo 15 Mini ITX chassis from SilverStone. Now, this is actually going to be a follow-up to a recent review on the channel of the Sugo 14, also from SilverStone. These two chassis are very similar, and I'll go over the differences in a minute. But first, why am I choosing to review a chassis that's so similar to one I recently reviewed? Well, it's because a lot of people asked me at the time of that Sugo 14 review whether I would test it with an air cooler. I actually tested it with a 240mm all-in-one liquid cooler and found the results to be amazing. And it was really my recommendation in terms of a setup for that chassis. But a lot of people are into air cooling, and this chassis and the Sugo 14 have a lot of space for it. So I figured, well, rather than go back and retest the Sugo 14, I'll just pick up the Sugo 15 so you get a look at this new chassis as well as the air cooling capacity of the two chassis together. Now, I won't be doing an apples to apples comparison. I'm not going to go back and retest the Sugo 14, but I will be testing this with a couple of different air coolers to show you which ones work and which ones don't. Now, in terms of features, I went over a lot of this with the Sugo 14, so I'm just going to highlight the differences that the Sugo 15 brings to the table. First of all, it's made of aluminum. That's going to be the most obvious one, and it's also going to be the biggest contributor to the price increase. This comes in around $180 when it hits the market in late November. The Sugo 14, which launched in October, comes in around $110. So right away, you see there's a big price difference, and the major reason is the aluminum versus steel. But there are a couple of other upgrades here as well. First of all, you get bigger cutouts in the side panels to allow more airflow through, and you also have much better filters that I'll show you a little bit later in this review. Another upgrade is you get USB Type-C in the front rather than a USB 2.0 in that place on the Sugo 14. And you also have a slightly different internal structure. This one will not accommodate an optical drive. Now, most people don't need that anyway, and for me, I actually think that's a bonus. I have less sheet metal I have to throw out after I'm done building up the system. But if you do need that optical drive bay, you're going to have to stick with the Sugo 14. Now, with that out of the way, let's talk about the coolers that I have on the bench. Here we have the Noctua D15S. That's a single fan dual tower 140mm class cooler. Then we have the Scythe Fuma 2. That is a dual tower, dual fan 120mm class cooler. And finally, we have the Noctua D15 Chromax Black. This is dual fan, dual tower, and about as big as you can get. Now, I have to admit, I was inspired by some social media and Reddit posts showing people trying to make the most of the Sugo 14 right out of the gate before there were even reviews out there. Now, with the Sugo 15, I'm going to try to do the same and be creative and show you all the options, but I'm going to go one better, and I'm going to show you the thermal benchmarks. Because it's one thing to be creative, and it's another thing to be right. And I want to be right. So I'm going to do a lot of what you saw in those social media posts, but I'm going to show you which ones actually make sense. Now, in terms of the layout here, I will be doing as much as I can with the three coolers I have in terms of fitting them in the chassis. If they don't fit, I can't use them. But if they do fit, I'll try to do as many different configurations as possible, including reversing the airflow, pulling it in from the back and out the front or top, as it were. Now, in terms of the fans, this does come with one 120mm fan mounted in the back from the factory, but I decided that as long as I'm using upgraded coolers here, I'm going to upgrade the fan too because it's a pretty cheap fan. I'm going to go with a Scythe Kazaflex 140, and I'm going to be mounting it on the side, which is basically up here in the way I've oriented here on the bench. And the reason that I put it up there is it's actually the only place you can fit a 140mm fan, as I will be showing you in a moment. The test bench I used for this review included an AMD Ryzen 7 Pro 4750G 8-core processor mounted in a Gigabyte B550i Aorus motherboard, an RTX 2080 Ti video card from EVGA, and an SFXL power supply from SilverStone. I had to remove this case frame from the rear of the chassis to install any of my test coolers, but I quickly found that I couldn't mount it on top either, as I mentioned, so I went ahead and used a fan in the side of the chassis. Unfortunately, that wasn't the only clearance issue I experienced. Here I am trying to put the side panel on with the D15 installed. It's a no-go. It's hitting the side of the heatsink. This is not going to work on an AM4 motherboard. I know a lot of folks wanted to use this cooler in this chassis, but it's not going to appear in my benchmarks. Luckily for you Noctua fans, the D15S fit perfectly in this chassis when its offset was pointed towards the video card. And to emulate a D15, I added an extra fan to this in my benchmarks. Now, based on the specs, you might think you could fit a top fan above the Scythe Fuma 2, and while it could be installed, it actually hit the heat pipe sticking out of the cooler, so like the Noctua coolers, there was going to be no top fan mounted in this chassis with the Fuma 2 installed. Luckily, other than that, the Fuma 2 was a very easy installation and fit perfectly in this chassis. Proving to be a tighter benefit was the Noctua NH-D15S mounted up with 2 fans plus the Scythe Flex 140. Simply put, there was no extra room in this chassis with this setup. Here's another look at the NH-D15S with the dual fans attached. I actually tested the NH-D15S in 4 different configurations, both a standard single and then dual fans, and I also reversed the fans in both of those setups so the air came in through the back and out of the Scythe fan, which I also flipped. Note that with the Scythe Fuma 2, I didn't do any flipping of the orientations, but I did do one thing that is a little bit different, which is I tested the case both in the standard configuration with the GPU on the side and then with the rotated case here. But because the extended feet that SilverStone includes for this setup just ruined the presentation of the case, I used a lower feet knowing that it was going to cut off some airflow to the GPU. Now this first set of benchmarks includes only the Sugo 15, but with 6 different cooler configurations as I've discussed. And taking a look at the benchmarks, we can see that they're all fairly quiet except for the dual fan exhaust setup of the NH-D15S. You have those 2 fans and their motors are pointed towards the user. As for the temperature measurements, I'm not going to comment too much on the CPU temps. They're pretty inconsequential here, being fairly similar. But the GPU temps are fairly high, and all those ones that are above 50 degrees do have me concerned because my GPU flips from passive to active mode at 55 degrees, and that means I could hear that fan flip on and off with some of these tests. It's also an indication that having to move the case fan from the back of the case to the side opposite the GPU really is detrimental to GPU temps. Turning to my first load test here using the CPU-Z built-in stress test, I found that the dual fan configurations of the NH-D15S were clearly louder, but they weren't clearly better. Overall, the best performer here is actually the Noctua NH-D15S with its standard configuration of a single fan set to exhaust. Where things get really interesting is in the gaming benchmark using Battlefield 4. With the GPU producing its own heat, you're left trying to optimize either the CPU temps or the GPU temps. Focusing on the Scythe Fuma 2 in the flat and rotated case orientations, clearly the GPU skyrockets in temp when it's on its side, just as expected, keeping in mind I'm using the lower feet here. But on the other hand, the CPU temp is actually better. Now let's turn to the Noctua that has 4 different configurations here. It gets pretty confusing, but one thing is for sure, when you set your fans to intake, you heat up your GPU. There's just no way for the GPU's heat to escape this case. It gets stuck in there and the GPU's running at 82 degrees. That's really too hot for this GPU. On the other hand, if I'm looking to optimize for that GPU temp, it means I'd pick the Noctua NH-D15S with a single fan set to exhaust, which would translate to the highest CPU temp. So overall, I think the best setup is actually the Noctua NH-D15S with dual fans set to exhaust. That's the best overall combination of GPU and CPU temps, and yet it's also the loudest. Given that the altered configurations I tested for the Fuma 2 and the NH-D15S didn't really produce clearly superior results, I'm just going to advance the Fuma 2 and the NH-D15S in single fan exhaust configuration to the next round of benchmarks. That means it's time to bring, among others, the Sugo 14 back into the mix to compete against the Sugo 15, keeping in mind that the Sugo 14's vent and mesh quality are a lot lower, so the Sugo 15 does have more airflow through this really nice flexible mesh, but it's running an air cooler instead of a liquid cooler. And from the get-go, looking at the idle benchmarks against 5 other chassis, the SilverStone SG15 doesn't look that good. It's actually very quiet, which is great, but it's also pretty hot. But let's take a look at that CPU-Z stress test. It's actually looking fairly good here. It continues to be the quietest chassis in this roundup, and it's also very good in terms of CPU temps, but watch out for this GPU temps. At idle, this GPU does get pretty hot in this case. Ultimately, the gold standard benchmark for me is the gaming benchmark, where I have both the GPU and CPU at load. And here, the Sugo 15 is only somewhere in the middle. It's way behind the liquid-cooled Sugo 14, and it's also well behind the SFF time PATX V2 with a tiny id cooling IS60 cooler on there. That just goes to show how important case design is when it comes to air cooling. I think the Sugo series is very good with liquid coolers, but I just don't think the air coolers make the best of its design. All right, well, I hope that my benchmarks answered all the burning questions you guys have had ever since I posted my Sugo 14 review. Overall, I'd still go with a 240mm all-in-one liquid cooler with this layout. But if you want to go air, you can go with the Scythe Fuma 2 or the Noctua NH-D15S. You cannot go with the D15, as I showed, at least on the AMD AM4 platform. Now, between the Fuma 2 and the D15S, I'd go with the Fuma 2 just because it's cheaper and posts up very similar benchmarks. The D15S, of course, also just comes in beige right now, but good news, Noctua just announced that they will be releasing a Chromax Black edition of that cooler so you can get that upgraded look, even if the performance is the same. That one's going to be coming in at $90, so still 50% more than the Fuma 2 for basically the same performance. That's why I go with the Fuma 2 in this chassis. If you want to go with air cooling, my personal preference is going to be liquid every time. Now, in terms of whether or not I recommend the Sugo 15 over the Sugo 14, the answer is no. The price is simply too high at $180, and while I really like the aluminum finish, it did come with a drawback, which was that it was really easy to scratch on my work surface. If you do go with the Sugo 15, definitely put a towel down on your work surface because these panels scratch just by moving them around on my wood table. Now, in terms of the Sugo 14, though, there's still something that I wish it had. Perhaps SilverStone can release something like a Sugo 16 in the near future that uses this cutout design on these aluminum panels, but does it in steel to save a lot on the cost. I'd love to see a Sugo 14 with the bigger cutouts, the upgraded nylon filter, plus USB Type-C. That would be a perfect product. Perhaps SilverStone could bring that out at maybe $140, $150. It would be an absolute winner. And I think it would have people a little less concerned about the price increase over the Sugo 14. Now, if you had any questions about this review, please post them down below. I'll be sure to get back to you. If you enjoyed it, of course, give me that like and subscribe. That gives me that extra incentive to give you more videos like this in the future. And until next time, I'm Ari from the Tech Buyers Guru.